There we go. Okay. Usually, a paper like this, you either start out, I've got some data set, I'm crunching it and drawing conclusions from that, or I'm setting up kind of a theoretical model and thinking about that. This paper really came out from things I see that make me wonder. And so I'm hoping that I exceed the 5 greater than 2 bar here. But the thing I see or saw that made me wonder is, why do I never see a well-funded defined benefit pension plan? And this started out about a year ago. I was reading an article in the Wall Street Journal about church pensions, which I'd forgotten existed. But churches, church hospitals, schools, things like that, they are poorly funded, participant benefits at risk. A few years before that, we have multi-employer pensions, underfunded, require a bailout. Before that, we have this long discussion of state and local government pensions. And so it just sort of struck me, whatever I see is underfunded. And so I just try to draw thoughts on that, but there's sort of this kind of dog that didn't bark aspect to it. The way I think about it is really in 2 threads. I mean, a lot of my work is on general look at retirement security, retirement savings adequacy in the U.S. And there's this kind of sort of narrative that's almost taken for granted that the decline of defined benefit pensions in the private sector has been detrimental to retirement income security. And you can see why that would be. The DB plan had automatic enrollment. The contributions are set by an actuary. The investments are professionally managed. And at retirement, it's all turned into annuity. This is seemingly everything that we want. The 401ks, particularly when they started, required you to do all of that yourself. So there is this general view that as we shift from DBs to DC, this put retirement security at risk. So that's one thread. The second thread draws on the debate over pension actuarial standards in the state and local government sector that really happened over the last, 15 or so years. And the question is, what does it mean for defined benefit pension to be fully funded, to be adequately funded? In what's called GASB, Government Accounting Standards Board, this is the accounting rules that state and local pensions operate under. Essentially, full funding means that in expectation, the assets of the plan will be sufficient to pay the liabilities of the plan. Meaning, if you get the assumed return on your portfolio, which would say around 7%, that you'll be able to pay your benefits. The sort of the economic valuation, but you've got this kind of market or financial economics critique of this GASB accounting, was that I had a spelling error there. It essentially means if you are promising benefits that must be paid under nearly all circumstances, you intend them to be paid, they're legally required to be paid, full funding means you have the ability to pay them under almost all circumstances, which means that simply looking at the expected return on your assets doesn't tell you something, because if they underperform, you have this contingent liability to come in and make additional contributions later, which obviously we've seen throughout the state and local sector. Now, this is sort of it's very an interesting theoretical debate, but to the degree it's theoretical, I think it really was decided in favor of this sort of economic view of things. Whenever sort of, dispassionate groups were asked to opine on it, they really came down in favor of this economic valuation approach, which essentially says, if you're promising a bond-like benefit, you should use a lower bond yield to discount them. So we had, 98% of economists surveyed, the CBO, Federal Reserve, the National Accounts data revalue the liabilities given to them by state and local government pensions. Bond rating agencies do the same. Even now, the Actuarial Standards Board says the pensions at least have to disclose these liabilities. Now, it hasn't changed anything how pensions have actually been funded, but in terms of what we think of for what a pension to be fully funded, what it means for it to be fully funded, I think we have a view that the pension contributions have to be quite a bit higher, and the pension assets have to be quite a bit higher relative to the benefits offered. Now, one of the things one way to think about this is to think about how these different views affect the deal that is offered by a defined benefit plan. If you're in, a state and local plan today with a discount rate of 7%, based on expected return of 7%, What that means is the participants, on average as a group, are receiving a 7% guaranteed return on their contributions and on their employer contributions. Because it's just how the actuarial math works out. If you're using, and if you think back to the days of essentially 0% interest rates and state and local plans were using an 8% discount rate, I mean, this is just an unbelievably good deal. If offered the deal, I would take it any day of the week. When you're thinking about what it means for a plan to be fully funded, when you're using, say, I don't know, a 3-4% discount rate, the contributions have to be roughly twice as high. And the effective rate of return the participants are getting is closer to the bond yield. So it's just worth thinking about what this means for the deal that is offered to the participants. Now, we have one part of the pension sort of universe which is regulated reasonably close to this economic view of what full funding means. And that's private sector single employer plans, which are subject to ERISA. ERISA requires that the benefits be discounted using a corporate bond yield, not the expected return assets. The assets don't have to be invested in bonds, but they must be sufficient to pay benefits if they earn the bond yield. So this implies much higher levels of contributions and assets. You have to address unfunded liabilities quickly. An ERISA regulated plan is better for the participants. Accepting the rate of return deal, the benefits are much more secure. There's more reasonable vesting. So post ERISA, two things happen to private sector DB plans. The first is this is drawn from Fed data. The plans are much better funded today than they were in the past. In the 60s and 70s, private DB plans are on average 70% funded. That's gone up, usually around 90% since then. This is based on it's actually the Bureau of Economic Analysis, is sort of rough shorthand for valuing the liabilities. If you actually look at the formal valuations done by private DB plans, I think at this moment they are over 100% funded. So in that sense, ERISA had the intended effect. Your pensions are much better funded, much safer than they used to be, pose much less of a bailout risk for the federal government. But a second thing happened, and that's your coverage rate of private sector employees in DB plans. If you go to the peak of coverage by 1975, it was just under 40% of private sector employees were covered by a plan, and we can get into what that means for benefits. Today, it has fallen to formally around 10%, but these numbers really understate the degree to which DB plans have shrunk. If you're thinking of think of the worker from the 1950s, what he has is a final salary DB plan. That's all he has. Among that 10% today, a good chunk are multi-employer pensions, which are a different animal. A good chunk are cash balance plans. So to the degree many people still have a DB plan, it's mixed with a DC. So that idea of I have this traditional pension, that's all I have, that's all I need, is basically gone. So it's worth looking at some of these counterfactuals and saying, where did or do DB plans exist? And pre-ERISA private sector, as I said, you had about 40% coverage. The funding practices were largely discretionary, which meant it gave the employers some discretion on how to fund them and how rigorously. They didn't have to pay PBGC, and you had very strict vesting rules. And what this often meant, if you say about 40% of employees were covered by a DB plan in the private sector, in reality, only about 1 out of 10 formally covered employees actually collected a benefit from it. So look, you can see why employers be willing to sponsor this. The downside is you don't get your benefit. Even if you're a participant, you may not get your benefit. And if your sponsor goes bankrupt, then you still don't get your benefit. So you can see, though, how DB plans continue to exist. DB plans also continue to exist in state and local government, which are not covered by ERISA, as Jim said earlier. So you still have all near universal coverage. The contributions in state and local pensions are far, far lower than they would be if those plans were, good grief, Sorry, phone ringing. Then those plans were covered by ERISA. They have more flexibility on investing. The GASB liabilities are put in the balance sheet. They're not subject to interest rate risk, and the reported liabilities are much, much lower than they would be using ERISA. So this gives us some idea of, imagine if you had PRC, public employees, or Public Employment Retirement Income Security Act. If state and local plans were covered by ERISA, my guess is they would have gone the way of private DB plans. If they were subject to the same regulations, the same funding requirements, I think it's quite likely they would have shifted to DC plans as well. If you shift back, again, going back about 10 years, this very vibrant debate over how to value public plan liabilities, they certainly treated the possibility of you having to use a lower discount rate on their liabilities as this existential threat. I mean, and so it's almost implicit. They said, if we had to follow ERISA-like rules, our plans are going to go the way of ERISA. So this gives you some idea of where DB plans continue to exist and why. We have other DB plans that survived as well. As I mentioned, the church pensions, they lobbied in the 70s for exemptions from ERISA. They got them. They are now underfunded, and the benefits are threatened. Multi-employer pensions, they're subject to ERISA, but they're allowed to use much higher discount rates, much longer amortization periods. Also not well funded. Going back to 2021, they required a $100 billion bailout. So again, it's showing you the trade-off, that you can have a DB plan, but you can't have a well-funded DB plan, at least as economists see it. So what this made me think, though, is that perhaps the benefits of a defined benefit plan are not worth the full economic cost of providing it, which is that the consensus on the economic view is that a well-funded DB plan requires a high level of contributions and assets, but where those funding standards are applied, the DB plans just basically disappear. Where those standards are not applied, the DB plans can continue, so you have this trade-off. And so you can have a DB plan if you're willing to live with the benefit risk to participants, the risk of a government bailout, or you can have no DB plan at all. And that just made me think about what is the value of it essentially to the participants. If the employers thought this really provides full value to employees, they would either increase the contributions or mandate contributions to the employees. But it seems they said, there's just better uses of our money. Another angle on this was think about how households have responded to the decline of DB pensions. Most people saving for retirement in the private sector today don't have a DB plan. They have a 401k or a similar retirement account. And what got me here was the idea that an individual on their own can't precisely replicate what a DB plan does, but they can get a lot closer than they currently are. I mean, if you wanted to have something that provided a high level of benefits with protection against market risk, save a lot, put it in bonds. If you want to protect yourself against longevity risk, buy an annuity. This is it's not perfect, but my point is nobody even tries to do that. The average 401k account holds about 70% of stocks. Almost nobody purchases life annuities. Very, very unusual. One final thing, the so-called bridge strategy where you could use your 401k to pay for the early years of retirement, then claim later, that really allows you to have a defined benefit pension. You could increase your DB replacement rate by about 20 percentage points by doing it. I'm fine if people do it, but very few people do. And so this gets this sort of revealed preferences. It's possible people are just wrong, but it doesn't seem they're seeking out what DB plans offer. So kind of my takeaway of this is it is possible people are just wrong about this. But just to go very quickly on why they may not be is I think there's the possibility that households feel they can take more investment risk because they have flexibility on their retirement ages that a DB plan doesn't, or it has a very difficult time having. If you delay, say if you're your 401k underperforms, you're suffering the market risk. If you delay retirement by just a year, you can make up quite a bit of that. Alternately, if you do well, you retire a little bit earlier. DB plans kind of lack that flexibility. And I also think on the annuitization end, and this is kind of speculative, but my gut is that as Social Security benefits grow higher in real terms, people may perceive the marginal value of an annuitization as lower, so they don't feel quite the need to do that. So this just thinking about this of how employers responded to ERISA, how state and local governments respond to the threat of ERISA-type accounting, how households respond to the absence of DB plans, makes me just reassess whether the decline of DB plans in the private sector was as grave a detriment to retirement security as is commonly thought. And I am done. Thank you very much.